Welcome to Lead with Less. I'm Tash Peterson, your host, certified people leadership coach, and I'm jumping into this episode today talking all about unintended consequences. Now, the reason that I wanted to do this episode, and hopefully I will keep it short and sharp for you, is because this came up in conversation this week in my VIP leadership development program. Now, at the time of releasing this will be quite some time ago that I'm reporting this, but I know that this is going to be really, really insightful and really impactful for you, especially if you are a people leader. If you are not yet a people leader, or maybe you are leading in different ways, like whether that's a project or a community group or anything like that, these are actually going to still be quite relevant for you. And they are really good things to be mindful of and to be aware of in the way that you're showing up, in the way that you're doing things, in the way that you are really actioning your leadership. So I really wanted to dive into this and really do a dedicated episode on this, because this is something that I actually talk about quite a lot and something that not a lot of people actually think about a lot. So I really hope that this is helpful for you. Now, what are unintended consequences? When I did some research, this is the definition that I found. Unintended consequences are the results of an action that differ from the expected outcome. As the name implies, these consequences are not the intended outcome of the action taken. Unintended consequences can be either positive or negative. Perfect. Exactly what it is. Now, I've never actually looked at the definition of this. I've just always instinctively known what I mean by unintended consequences. And I want to share 5 unintended consequences that may happen if you do these particular things. Now, there could be so many other unintended consequences that could absolutely come up, and I'm not going to be able to predict them all. I mean, the whole idea is that they're not necessarily predictable, but the more aware that we can be about, well, what could actually happen if I did this thing, the more that we might be able to foresee some of these things that could happen. And the more mindful and aware we are of these, the better we're actually going to set ourselves up to be able to navigate them when and if they come up. So let's just dive into each of these. And as always, I would really love to know if you've had some unintended consequences come up for you and how that's shown up for you and the impact that it's had, because I really just love to know this stuff. Number 1, quick responsiveness. So something that I see a lot with the people that I coach, and I absolutely was a culprit of this early on in my career, was I saw a lot of value into being quick to respond. So I'd get an email and I'd look at it and be like, oh, this is an easy answer. I'll just quickly reply and I'll just quickly shoot off this thing. And because I wanted to get it off my plate, I wanted to clear it out of my emails or my to-do list. However, one of the biggest unintended consequences that comes from being quick to respond or quick responsiveness is the expectation for quick turnarounds. So what happened for me early on in my career is I took a lot of value from being able to be quick to respond to people, because I was like, well, if I can get this back to them, they can move on with their job a lot quicker. But 2 things would happen. Number 1 is I wouldn't get through my work fast enough because I was constantly just getting quick stuff back to other people, which means I wasn't spending enough time doing my own meaningful work. And number 2 was people were coming to expect that I would be quick in responding. So people would seek me out purposefully because they knew I was quick to work, which means that they came to me because they wanted a quick turnaround on whatever they were doing, and they expected me to do that every single time. Now, on surface level, on face value, probably not a terrible thing, right? That's being really helpful. That's being really supportive of other people. But it had a negative consequence on me because I wasn't getting through the stuff that I needed to get done. And I was constantly getting interrupted by people who wanted me to do things for them. Again, I don't want to seem unhelpful or don't want to create that kind of expectation, but the unintended consequence of me trying to build credibility and trying to be of value to other people was having an impact on my ability to do my job really well. So one way to reduce the chance of this unintended consequence happening is to be mindful of how responsive you are and to be strategic and tactful in how responsive you are. So for me, I actually ended up turning all of my email notifications off on my phone, on my desktop, on my laptop, everything like that throughout my whole career. I never had email notifications on. And a few times a day, I would go into my inbox when I had created intentional space to reply to those things, and then I would get back to them. And so it created this delay between something coming into my inbox and me then replying to it, which then meant that I got the stuff done that I needed to get done. And I didn't create this expectation that I was just constantly going to be at the beck and call of everyone else. And this might be different if your whole job is purely responding to emails and that is literally where your workload is coming from. Absolutely fine, right? That is the expectation of your job. But for the majority of people that probably listen to this podcast, A lot of your work is probably very focused work, project work, things that take time and space to be able to do. So you can't be at the beck and call of your emails and your phone and all of those things. So be really mindful of having high responsiveness, quick responsiveness, and the expectation that that can create for the people who interact with you. The second unintended consequence, high accessibility can create overdependence. And I see this happening a lot, particularly for new or early team leaders or managers or leaders, where they have a really high emphasis on being really accessible to their team. So their team has constant access to them. They can always reach out to them. They can always message them. They can always call them, email them, pop up to their desk and ask them questions. But what can happen, an unintended consequence that can come from this is a hyper or an over dependence from the team onto the manager, which means that if you're too accessible, if you're too available all of the time, your team is going to take advantage of that, not necessarily maliciously, but because it can be the easier option. Why am I going to spend a whole bunch of time trying to figure it out if I can just go and quickly ask my manager, who will likely have the answer, right? So high accessibility can create overdependence, and that's something that we have to be extremely careful of when we step into people leadership, because overdependence can also equal lack of accountability, lack of ownership, lack of initiative, lack of problem solving, and it can create a huge amount of overwhelm for you because you're never getting done what you need to get done because you're constantly being interrupted and being asked for things by your team, which they might actually be able to solve and work through on their own. So be really intentional with your accessibility level. Again, I'm not saying to just close yourself off and never be accessible, but make sure that your accessibility to your people and to your team also works for you, also ensures that you get the things that you need to get done. Another way that you can also mitigate overdependence and also really balance out accessibility is to make sure that you have really solid and consistent one-on-ones with your team. If you are giving your team dedicated one-on-one time where you're having meaningful conversations with them, they are going to feel seen, heard, and acknowledged without needing to constantly bombard you for things. And also, if you are effectively training and supporting your people, they're also going to feel empowered to work through the things that they need to work through. And what I'll do is in the show notes, I'll put my template for one-on-one catch-ups with your team. It's a template that you can use to run your one-on-ones that have the best questions to ask to build the best trust, respect, and connections with your team. So find that in the show notes. The third action that can potentially create unintended consequences is consistently fixing and solving things, which can create an unintended consequence of lack of ownership and accountability. Now, one of the biggest challenges that individual contributors have when they step into people leadership is they've gone from being really great individual contributors to now being a facilitator of results and outcomes and getting things done. And often, a lot of that challenge shows up in constantly wanting to fix and solve things for people. One, because it's easier. It's like, oh, I know how to do it. I'll just quickly do it. And two, coaching can take a bit more time. And a lot that I hear of, I just don't have time to coach them. I just don't have time to tell them. It's like, well, you're actually wasting a lot more time by constantly fixing and solving rather than empowering them to do that themselves. So the unintended consequence that shows up here is a lack of ownership and accountability that needs to stay with your team, that needs to stay with your people for what they are working through. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't ask for support, that they don't ask for help, but they need to maintain complete ownership and accountability of the thing that they're working on to make sure that they are the ones that are driving it from start to completion. Fixing and solving, it's helpful in the short term, right? Because it gets things done, it gets things over the line, it gets things off the plate. But in the long term, it creates a real problem because people don't learn how to stay accountable and own the things that they need to own. And I'm actually working with a one-on-one client at the moment where their whole organizational culture actually lacks ownership and accountability because there's a lot of this fixing and solving that's been happening that they're now trying to reset the culture where they're transferring ownership and accountability to where it belongs with individuals. So yes, I know how great it feels to fix, to solve, because, as a leader, it gives us that sense of achievement. But we need to be really careful about whether we are taking over ownership of something rather than keeping ownership. where it is. Ways that you can mitigate this is when someone comes and asks you to help them solve something or to work through something or to fix something, is to really use coaching questions to maintain ownership over this thing. So it could be, okay, so talk me through what the problem is. Okay, what are some of the solutions that you've already worked through? Okay, if those haven't worked, what are some other possible solutions that you can test, that you can experiment with? Okay, that sounds like a really good one. I think that one could potentially work. So, how are you going to move forward with that? It's maintaining the conversation that they are owning all of these aspects, not, oh, okay, I think I could fix this. I'll let you know how I go. Because now all of a sudden you've transferred that onto your plate, which now means it becomes your problem. And so we just need to be very mindful of this because we want to ensure that we're setting our people up to feel empowered and to feel capable of solving and fixing their own things. You can be there to support them, you can be there to navigate it with them, but not being the one that does it for them. Such a key one. And also, when we do this too much, we can also create a sense of overwhelm, right? Because now our plate's getting bigger. We've got now more problems to solve. I've now got my job, plus I've got Tom, Harry's, and Susan's job of their tasks, and it just snowballs and it really gets out of control. So, we really, really want to be mindful of this. Again, it's another one that on face value isn't inherently bad. It's not inherently wrong. However, when left unchecked, when done too much, it can really put us in a bind. And so we need to be very mindful of it. The fourth action, doing instead of delegating, which can lead to an unintended consequence of lack of growth and engagement. And this comes up a lot. This is probably one of the most talked about challenges when it comes to management and leadership is the ability to effectively delegate, again, so that we maintain accountability and ownership of where it belongs and to reduce the overwhelm and workload of our own plates. One challenge that I set to a lot of the leaders that I work with in one-on-one coaching is your goal for the next month is to walk out of every team meeting with the least amount of actions. And I can always see the discomfort there, but it comes back to this fixing and solving thing that I talked about in the last point. But it also makes sure that we're delegating properly because if we are the ones as the manager, the leader, the boss, the business owner, whatever the context is, if we're the one that's walking out of every meeting with the most action points, there's something amiss here. That means that our team is likely not doing the things that they're actually really good at and that can actually create the growth and engagement that they need in order to feel satisfied in their jobs. The things that are easy to us, it's easy to us because we've been doing it. That makes sense. But in order to grow and keep our team engaged, we need to do things that stretch them. And so we need to delegate with intention and with purpose. And we do this by knowing the strengths of our team, knowing what they enjoy doing, plus knowing what gaps are that they're looking at filling. What are the development areas that they're looking at focusing on? And how can I delegate things that I'm working on, things that are on my plate in order to support their growth and development? That is one of the best things that we can do as leaders. And if we are holding on to stuff, if we're hoarding tasks, if we're hoarding jobs and projects and things like that because it's quote unquote easier or quote unquote, I really like doing it, we're not setting our teams up for success. We're not setting our teams up to feel engaged, satisfied, stretched, which then helps their growth, right? The more engaged our teams are, the more growth oriented they are, the more stretched they are within the scope of they have the skills to do it, but they need to stretch, they need to really develop themselves, the more successful we are as a team. So the more that we can do that, the more that we can set our teams up for that, the better equipped you're going to be to have a really successful and really high performing team. So you need to make sure that you are focusing on delegation and doing it intentionally and purposefully, making sure that how you're delegating is supporting your team, it's setting them up for success, and it's setting the right people up with the right work. Everyone on your team should not be having the same strengths. They should not all have the same gaps. They should all have different strengths that close different gaps amongst the team. That's how you really build high performing teams. I did record an episode all around setting and managing expectations, so we will link it down in the show notes. It was released actually a couple of weeks ago, or even last week at the time of this release. So we'll link that in the show notes. And that's a really good one to help you with your delegation because often I see leaders really hesitating with delegating because they struggle to trust that they're going to get back what they need. And they end up spending too much time fixing. And the answer I have to that is your expectations weren't clear enough. Your expectations weren't set up properly that set the person up to actually deliver good work. So knowing how to set expectations and knowing how to give feedback is going to help you to delegate intentionally. But this is definitely something that in the short term, it doesn't seem like a problem. In the short term, it doesn't seem like it matters that much, but in the long term, it really has a detrimental impact. So we need to be very mindful of it. And the last action that can lead to unintended consequences is silent kindness, which leads to frustration, resentment, and toxicity. I left the big one for last. Silent kindness is the quadrant in the radical candor model by Kim Scott that I renamed from ruinous empathy, which is the American language that she uses. I changed this to silent kindness. Silent kindness is when we stay silent because we're trying to be kind to other people. But really, I need to change the to silent niceness, because being nice is to satisfy, it's to appease, it's to people please, it's to make sure that the boat doesn't rock. Whereas being kind is actually about being direct, holding boundaries, being firm. But silent kindness really is this habit or this tendency to avoid having difficult conversations. It's avoiding talking about what is necessary because we're trying to keep the peace. We're trying to not hurt people's feelings. We're trying to be liked. And this has some very, very serious unintended consequences because, again, in the moment, it feels good. In the moment, it feels comfortable. In the moment, it feels easy. But again, in the long term, it creates really big problems because we're not dealing with things as they come up. We're not dealing with small issues, which then compound into big problems. And we're not dealing with things that inevitably impact other people. One of the biggest things that when this shows up a lot when we are avoiding dealing with poor performers, where people are not meeting expectations, where we are really avoiding having some necessary conversations, our high performers, the people that we rely on the most in our teams, are the ones that get affected the most by this because they are the ones that carry the burden, the workload, the expectation of the people who aren't delivering what they need to be delivering. And what that then breeds is frustration because they start getting frustrated of having to pull extra weight, having to do other people's jobs. Then they start getting resentful because now I'm doing two people's jobs. I'm not getting paid extra. I'm not getting acknowledged for this while this person's just coasting over there. And then if that still is left unchecked, if those problems are still not being addressed, it then leads to toxicity where we start having passive aggressive behavior, we start having arrogant aggressive behavior, we start creating this culture of we are happy just to let things kind of go. And then we lose our best people because they're going to get to the point where they're fed up with it and they're not going to want to deal with it anymore. And so to keep the peace in the moment leads to some serious consequences in the future because we're then dealing with cultures that are now even more challenging to change. And this is something that I talk about a lot. It's toxic cultures didn't just happen overnight. It was a compounding effect of a lot of small things, small bad behaviors, small toxic behaviors that were tolerated over time that then built itself into this toxic culture. And all of that starts with silent kindness. All of that starts with, I want to keep the peace. I want to not rock the boat. I don't want people to not like me. So I'm just not going to say anything. And a few weeks ago, I actually sent an email to my newsletter talking about you're a manager now, you're not going to be liked. And it's about accepting that. Being kind, being firm, holding boundaries, holding expectations, that is actually the best kindness that you can have because it shows people what the expectations are. It shows people what will be tolerated and what won't be tolerated. And people thrive in environments where those things are clear. So we need to be very careful about this. So there are the 5 actions that can lead to unintended consequences to be aware of, especially as a leader. I'll go through them again. Quick responsiveness can lead to an expectation of quick turnaround. High accessibility can lead to creating overdependency and overwhelm. Fixing and solving can lead to a lack of ownership and accountability. Doing instead of delegating can lead to lack of growth and engagement. And again, overwhelm. Silent kindness can lead to frustration, resentment, and toxicity. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer here and say that I'm not saying that these things are absolutely going to happen. These are definitely the things that I've seen across my career and that I coach a lot of my leaders through because this is the reality of what tends to happen. So the more aware you are of these things means that the more likely you are to notice it early, and then you can adjust course to do things that best support you. And all of the things that come back to this is having really clear boundaries, being able to set really clear expectations, knowing how to have difficult conversations. All of these things are down to the skills that you have as a leader. And now, all of the things that we work on and build up as your skill set in VIP leaders. So, if that is something that's of interest, join the interest list. The next round of VIP leaders will be enrolling early 2025. So, definitely get on board with that so you can get early discounts and early offers as well, which will only be available to the interest list. All right, so I'm going to leave this here. I would really love to know, how did this episode land with you? Did it resonate? What did you take away? And are there any other actions that you have noticed have unintended consequences that you've had to navigate and turn around? Really love to hear from you. All right, I will leave this here. Have a great rest of your day, rest of your week, and I'll be back with another episode next week.